The echo of the last sharp, terrible note I ever heard him sing still reverberates in the empty, silent chamber of my heart. I am Eleanor, 58, and the silence that followed David's sudden, brutal aneurysm 8 months ago is not merely the absence of his baritone voice. It is the death of my own. We were a duet, always. Our marriage, 35 years of quiet, sturdy companionship, was defined by the music we made together. Him on the acoustic guitar, me on the piano, our voices twining around the simple, aching beauty of the folk songs we loved. Now, the piano in the living room stands shrouded under a heavy linen cloth, a pale, silent sarcophagus. And my throat? My throat is closed, seized shut by the tight, relentless knot of my grief. The doctors, with their sterile reassurance, offered no physical diagnosis. Psychosomatic, Dr. Chen had murmured, adjusting her glasses. A common manifestation of complex grief, Eleanor. The vocal cords are fine. The will to create sound is blocked. The will to create sound. That phrase felt like a devastating indictment. It suggested that my sorrow was a deliberate, willful silence, a refusal to engage with a world David had abandoned. I live now in a house that smells perpetually of dust and unplayed music, in a corner of Minnesota where the winters are long and the silence is deep, cold, and absolute. I am not simply mute. I am unvoiced. I talk, yes, in the low, necessary mumble of transactions. Milk. 2, please, thank you. But I cannot sing. I cannot access the part of my spirit that translates emotion into melody. I remember the day I discovered the block. It was 3 months after the funeral. I was dusting David's record collection, his favorite LPs, Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, and, our sacred ground, Nick Drake. I picked up the record of Pink Moon. I remembered the way David's voice used to drop low, gravelly, and tender when we sang Things Behind the Sun, always looking at me, his eyes full of the quiet, deep certainty of our shared future. I walked to the piano. I lifted the cover, the movement disturbing the settled dust, making the strings shimmer faintly in the afternoon light. I sat down. My fingers, surprisingly, remembered the chords. A minor, G, C dollars. The opening progression, simple and sorrowful. I opened my mouth. I wanted the sound to come out. A note, a sigh, a broken whisper. I wanted the melody to carry the unbearable weight of his absence. Nothing. Only a thin, raspy expulsion of air, choked off instantly by the involuntary spasms in my throat. I tried again, pressing harder on the keys, forcing the air up. The sound was not a note. It was a desperate, ugly cry, a raw, tearing sound that belonged to an injured animal, not a grieving woman. I broke then. I laid my head down on the cool, yellowed ivory keys and wept, not for David, but for the life we had sung into existence, a life that was now forever muted. The silence of the house absorbed the sound of my grief, leaving no echo, no trace. Since that day, I had not tried again. The necessity of routine is what saves the paralyzed. I kept to a schedule imposed by inertia rather than will. The weekly trip to the small local grocery store, the Sunday visit to the cemetery, always brief, always silent, and the obligatory Monday afternoon drop-in at the library to exchange 2 heavy, unread volumes of historical fiction. It was during one of these inert evenings, wrapped in the thin metallic scent of a coming snow, that the intrusion began. My house sits slightly above the street, a Victorian with a wraparound porch and large, arched windows. I was in the living room, staring out at the darkening street, when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was a clear, strong tenor voice singing. The The voice belonged to a man, but it was high, almost ethereal, weaving through the cold air. It was followed by others, a deep bass note, a soaring soprano, and the gentle, grounding harmony of a mezzo. They were singing a madrigal, something intricate, complicated, and utterly beautiful. I walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet drape. Across the street was the old, renovated community center, a red brick building usually used for town meetings and the occasional bake sale. Tonight, its basement windows glowed with warm, yellow light. A small sign, half obscured by snow flurries, read, "The Lakeshore Community Choir, rehearsal every Monday." They were singing my silence into oblivion. I watched for an hour, unseen, listening to the swelling and retreating waves of sound. They were good. Not professional, but dedicated, their voices blending into a comforting, shared resonance. They were creating a world, a temporary, harmonious space where all the sharp edges of loneliness were smoothed out by the sound. The contrast between their vibrant, collective noise and my own dead internal landscape was almost unbearable. They were celebrating sound. I was suffocating in its absence. I listened until the music stopped, replaced by the polite, low murmur of shared laughter and scraping chairs. Then I watched them leave. A small, diverse group. An older woman bundled in a ridiculous fur coat, a young man with a messenger bag, a middle-aged couple walking arm in arm. They carried with them the visible aura of shared effort, a warmth that radiated into the cold street. I closed the drape, feeling exposed, judged by the simple fact of their existence. The next Monday, I didn't mean to watch. I truly didn't. I made myself dinner, ate it standing up, and started preparing for bed early. But the moment their voices started, a rich, complicated arrangement of a traditional Irish folk song, I found myself drawn back to the window. And this time, something happened. As the soprano hit a particularly high, pure note, I felt an almost physical sensation, a sharp, sudden pain deep in my diaphragm, like a muscle protesting its long neglect. A surge of desperate longing, so powerful it was nauseating, overwhelmed me. I wanted to join them, not to sing, but just to breathe their air, to stand near the machinery of their shared expression. The next day, I drove to the community center. I didn't go inside. I simply sat in my car in the empty parking lot, staring at the cheerful, weathered sign. I felt like an anthropologist, observing a mysterious, vibrant culture from a safe, sterile distance. When did the simple act of joining become a terrifying, insurmountable mountain? It was the 5th Monday before I did something truly reckless. They were singing Bach. It was complicated, formal, and majestic, the kind of music David and I rarely attempted, preferring the simplicity of the folk tradition. But the rigor of the composition, the mathematical precision of the harmony, was strangely soothing. I sat in my living room, the drapes slightly ajar, listening. The baritone, it wasn't David's, it was too refined, too trained, was carrying the deep foundational line, steady and strong. Suddenly, an impulse, raw and terrifying, took hold. I walked to the kitchen, poured a small glass of sherry, something I hadn't touched since the week David died, and downed it quickly. I needed the chemical release, the artificial lowering of my guard. I went back to the piano. I sat down, opened the dusty lid, and found the chords to Both Sides Now. A song David hated, claiming it was too sentimental. My song. The sherry was working. The familiar Adullo minor felt heavy, grounding. I played the melody, slow, tentative, the piano notes sounding thin and tinny after the rich sound of the choir across the street. I opened my mouth. tears already springing to my eyes, and tried to push the single simple line, "Rose and flow." The sound was worse than before. A strangled, painful wheeze. A failure so profound, it felt like a betrayal of the instrument, of the memory, of myself. I tried again, hitting the high C key in frustration. This time, the sound of my despair was too loud, too visible. I slammed the lid of the piano down, the resulting thud echoing the violence of my internal collapse. I stood up, trembling, convinced that the house was now contaminated by my profound lack of will. I didn't notice the basement door of the community center open. I didn't notice the tall, slender figure crossing the street, wrapped in a long, dark coat. I was standing in the center of the living room, weeping silently, the shame of my silence overwhelming me, when the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, insistent, utterly unexpected. I froze. No one ever rang my doorbell. Not after David. I walked to the door, peering through the peephole. Standing on my porch, dusted with fresh snow, was a woman. She was probably in her late 40s, tall, with kind, intelligent eyes, and a cap of severe dark hair. She held a black, leather-bound music score clutched to her chest. I didn't recognize her, but I knew who she was. The choir director, the source of the sound, the witness to my failure. I opened the door only a crack, keeping the chain latched. The cold air rushed in, smelling of pine and damp wool. "Eleanor," she said, her voice a deep, quiet mezzo, startlingly clear. She didn't ask how she knew my name. "I'm Martha Lindstrom. I'm the director of the Lakeshore Choir." "Yes," I managed, my voice a dry, rasping whisper. "I know." She didn't apologize for the intrusion. She looked directly into my eyes, her gaze calm, compassionate, and utterly unwavering. "I heard you just now," she said softly. "You hit a high C on the piano, and then a sound of great pain. We hear a lot of noise across the street, Eleanor. But that sounded like a song trying to be born." I felt my cheeks flush crimson with shame. The invasion was complete. "I can't sing," I admitted, the whisper tasting of dust and defeat. "I know," Martha replied gently, "but you're grieving. And grief is simply love with nowhere to go. Sometimes you need a different channel. You need a chorus." She paused, lifting the music score slightly. "We start our Christmas cantata rehearsals next week. It's difficult but restorative. You don't have to sing. You don't have to make a sound. You just have to listen with us. You just have to stand in the sound. Will you come? Just for one night. Just to stand in the middle of a melody." The offer was so simple, so absurdly generous, that it pierced through the thick armor of my sorrow. Just to stand in the sound. Is the risk of failing again greater than the punishment of staying silent forever? I tried to speak, but the familiar spasm tightened my throat. Martha smiled, a patient, knowing expression. "You don't have to answer now. Rehearsal is 7 o'clock next Monday. We'll leave the chair open." She didn't push. She simply nodded, turned, and walked back across the street, leaving me alone with the cold air and the impossible, frightening weight of her invitation. I closed the door, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. A chair. A space reserved for my silence. The idea of standing among strangers, surrounded by the physical act of creation, was terrifying. But the alternative, the relentless, suffocating silence of my own home, suddenly felt worse. The piano was muted. The house was dead. Maybe the only way to find my voice was to borrow one for a while. I had 7 days to decide whether to remain a solitary, unsung ghost, or to take the first trembling step into the choir for one. The week that followed Martha Lindstrom's visit was an elongated, painful study in indecision. The memory of her quiet, steady gaze and the sheer, staggering intrusion of her kindness had broken the comfortable, familiar rhythm of my grief. I had been content in my silence, a fortress built of sorrow and dust motes. Martha's invitation was a battering ram, demanding I open the gates. Every action felt charged with the weight of the coming Monday. When I washed the dishes, the movement of the sponge against the ceramic was timed to the phantom rhythm of a madrigal. When I walked through the house, I avoided the living room, terrified of encountering the piano, the physical evidence of my vocal collapse. Does true healing begin when the safety of silence becomes more frightening than the risk of sound? I spent hours sitting in the armchair David used to favor, watching the snow fall, a thick, insulating layer that made the world outside look both beautiful and utterly remote. I thought about Martha's words. Grief is simply love with nowhere to go. My love for David was vast, a roaring ocean trapped inside a teacup, and every attempt to express it had only resulted in that ugly, strangled wheeze. What if Martha was right? What if the voice was blocked not by physical damage, but by the sheer, crushing pressure of unreleased love? The thought of going to the community center, a place bustling with cheerful, purposeful people, made my palms sweat. I imagined the fluorescent lighting, the smell of cheap coffee and old sheet music, and the inescapable collective sound. My silence would be a physical vacuum, a public confession of my brokenness. I began to negotiate with myself the way one bargains with a cruel jailer. I wouldn't sing. I would stand near the back, near the exit. I would bring a book and pretend to be waiting for someone else. I would simply be an observer, a ghost in the chorus line. But the shame was a tenacious creature. What if one of them spoke to me? What if they asked my name, or worse, my part? I recalled a conversation with David, years ago, after a particularly demanding performance of a Bach piece. He had been exhausted, but elated. Choir singing isn't about perfection, Elle, he'd said, wiping the sweat from his brow. It's about surrender. It's about giving up your single voice so the collective can find the harmony. I had never fully understood that. I had always been fiercely protective of my own voice, my own melody. Now, realizing that my single voice was extinct, the idea of surrender, of vanishing into the rich, warm anonymity of the group sound, became profoundly alluring. Does surrender to the collective mean the loss of the self, or the discovery of a stronger, shared identity? Monday arrived, cold and clear. The daylight was thin, failing quickly. By 6 o'clock, the entire town was shrouded in the blue, metallic chill of the evening. I put on the thickest sweater I owned, a fisherman's knit that smelled faintly of cedar and David, and a heavy, unflattering parka. I wanted to disappear into the bulk, to become an indistinct mass of wool and shadow. I drove the short, icy distance to the community center. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles were white. The parking lot was already half full. Cars belonging to people with lives, with hobbies, with sound. I parked in the darkest corner, near a large, overgrown spruce tree. I sat there, the engine running, watching the plumes of my own anxious breath mist the windshield. 7 o'clock, the scheduled start. I could hear, faintly, the bright, rapid scales of someone warming up on a piano inside. I felt a sudden, fierce urge to turn the car around, to retreat back to the safety of my mute house. It was a physical pull, a gravitational force dragging me back into the familiar isolation. I reached for the gear shift. And then I stopped. I thought about the high C on the piano and the raw animal sound that followed it. I remembered the depth of the despair I felt when I realized my voice was gone. If I left now, that despair would become the permanent soundtrack of my life. I turned off the engine. The resulting silence was immense. I got out of the car. The cold air hit my face, sharp and cleansing. I walked across the parking lot, my boots crunching loudly on the frozen gravel. Each step felt like a victory, a rejection of the inertia that had claimed me for months. The entrance to the rehearsal room was down a narrow, painted staircase in the basement. As I descended, the smell intensified. A mix of old concrete, furniture polish, and the faint, coppery scent of bodies working hard. I could hear the voices now, close and clear. They were running a complicated vocal exercise. Me, mi, mo, ma, mo, mi, me. The sound was clean, precise, an exercise in controlled breathing and technical rigor. I paused at the doorway. The room was large, dominated by a battered upright piano and rows of folding chairs. About 20 people were standing, holding their music folders, their faces rapt with concentration. They were singers. They were doing the one thing I could not. Martha, standing near the piano, saw me immediately. She didn't pause the exercise. She didn't call attention to me. She simply offered a brief, knowing nod, a silent acknowledgement that I had kept my promise. There was a single empty chair in the back row, tucked against the wall near the water cooler, the space reserved for my silence. I slipped into the room, moving with the unnatural stiffness of a trespasser. I went directly to the empty chair and sat down, burying my hands deep into the pockets of my parka. I didn't look up, focusing instead on the worn, dusty linoleum floor. The exercise ended. A burst of relieved laughter followed. "Welcome, everyone," Martha said, her voice warm and authoritative. "And welcome to our visitor. Please, if you'd all wave to Eleanor in the back. Eleanor is just here to listen tonight, so let's make sure she feels comfortable." A ripple of warm, welcoming hands and faces turned toward me. The quick, kind smiles of strangers. No questions. No pressure. Just a wave, acknowledging my presence without demanding my participation. I managed a slight, awkward nod, feeling the sudden, unexpected heat in my cheeks. I was seen. And I was accepted, not despite my silence, but with it. "All right, let's get into the cantata," Martha announced, pivoting back to the piano. "Page 4, the Agnus Dei. Sopranos, listen for the entrance. Baritones, remember the suspension on the Dona Nobis Pacem." The cantata, the Christmas piece. The music was complex, densely layered with harmony. As they began to sing, the sound enveloped me. It was rich, deep, and physically resonant. I could feel the vibrations of the bass notes deep in my chest. I could hear the pure, crystalline quality of the sopranos floating above me, carrying the melody like a torch. I sat there, frozen, breathing in the sound. The music was a wall of structure, a fortress of order built entirely out of air and intent. I realized then that grief had not simply stolen my voice. It had destroyed the structure of my life. David's death was the ultimate discord. But here, in this humble, dusty basement, they were actively, collectively, rebuilding order. I started to focus on the individual voices. The man next to me, a quiet, older gentleman with a neatly trimmed beard, was a tenor, his voice thin but accurate. The woman in front of him, plump and wearing a bright purple scarf, was a mezzo, her voice like warm honey, grounding the harmony. I wasn't listening to them sing a song. I was listening to them breathe together, commit together, fail together, and correct together. Their shared effort was a living, breathing testament to the possibility of moving forward. When you listen to others create beauty, are you merely observing, or are you absorbing the blueprint for your own reconstruction? For the first 45 minutes, I remained completely inert. But as they repeated a particularly difficult section of the Dona Nobis Pacem, a passage of exquisite, yearning hope, my fingers began to tap a soft, involuntary rhythm on my knee. A pulse, a return of tempo. Then, Martha called a break. A sudden explosion of chatter and movement. People stretched, laughed, and walked toward the water cooler. The woman with the purple scarf turned around. Her name was Evelyn, she told me, her smile wide and warm. "Welcome," she said, leaning toward me confidentially. "I'm the designated hugger, and I'm also usually the one who loses the tempo. Don't worry. Martha just wants us to make noise, not perfection." She offered me a paper cup of weak, lukewarm coffee. I accepted it, my hands still shaking slightly. "You have the posture of a musician," Evelyn observed kindly, ignoring my silence. "Are you a pianist? Or maybe strings?" I managed to push out a single word, scratchy and unused. "Piano." "Ah, we need you. Our accompanist is prone to migraines," she joked. "But seriously, it's good you're here. My husband passed 2 years ago. I thought my voice was gone too. It wasn't. It was just hiding. Give it time, dear. We'll find it." She didn't pry. She didn't offer advice. She simply offered the shared, hard-won wisdom of a fellow traveler in grief. Her honesty, that simple admission, "I thought my voice was gone too," was a lifeline. The choir began to filter back to their seats. Evelyn gave my shoulder a quick, firm squeeze and returned to her spot. As the rehearsal resumed, they moved to a familiar folk song for a light break, an old sea shanty about the longing for home. I knew the melody. David and I used to harmonize to it while washing dishes. They were singing the verses, then the chorus. "Home, boys, home, it's home we ought to be. Home, boys, home, in the place we long to see." The bass line was strong, the melody plaintive. Without thinking, without warning, my right hand, still buried in my pocket, began to move. It was tracing the movements of my other life, the motion of David's baritone, the counter melody I always sang. I was conducting the rhythm inside the confines of my bulky parka. I wasn't singing. I was feeling the song, charting its emotional course, charting the emotional course of my life back toward structure. Martha caught my eye over the sheet music. She wasn't surprised. She didn't stop. She simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible encouragement. I closed my eyes. I let the sound flood my mind, letting the voices of the strangers become the temporary surrogate voice of my love. The pain in my chest was still there, the pressure of unreleased grief. But now, it was matched by the structural support of the bass, the tender hope of the mezzo. I didn't open my mouth. I didn't utter a sound. But I knew, with the cold, absolute certainty of a ship finding its compass point, that I had found the path back to the language of my heart. The path was not solitary. It was a chorus. I just needed to learn how to surrender. I was ready for the next note. I just needed to learn how to breathe again,